All right. So the first one question.
How long should the answers be?
Make it about 3 minutes each. I've got about 17 minutes, so I'll try and
That's
see.
a bit long, but I'll try.
Okay, you try. So the first question, generally what is your view of the civil society process and how it has handled it from Busan up to, from Accra to up to where we are now?
Now, first of all, what I think is very crucial in Busan, that we make a new manifesto on aid and development effectiveness. Aid and development effectiveness, both of them. And what is actually effectiveness? It's not a technocratic term only. It's not only something of a community of practice or of only the experts. In essence, aid effectiveness has to do with the ownership of people themselves in the development process. So, for instance, when we talk about these big principles like accountability, division of labor, the issue of predictability, that all sounds very difficult for everybody in the rest of the world. The key area is to what extent we know that aid and development reaches the people in terms of better health outcomes, better schooling, better infrastructure close to their homes, and you cannot align or harmonize your aid and development unless the people that count and for whom you're doing it are actually showing the results for them. And therefore I think the key element of Busan is get the civil society not only there to say something, but to be part of the implementation of Busan. And to ensure that the effectiveness of aid and development is related to their effective role in representing the people. So they might be service providers, but they also have to be the checks and balances.
But how do they do that, considering that I have seen some documents where some donors are actually using the terminology aid effectiveness and development effectiveness interchangeably, as though they mean the same thing?
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion in the development world, and you guys from the civil society are also to help make all these different terms a bit more simple. But I would say, as one of the co-chairs, the aid is still indispensable for instance, the fragile states. There's some people who like to frame aid only as something old-fashioned from the past, which never worked, was just the politics of the good intentions. Yes, aid did a lot of wrong things. It made people dependent. It often is done in a very difficult and complicated way with a lot of consultants not listening to the people. But there is also an enormous advantage to good aid. But then aid is a catalyst of things that people are doing themselves. And here the civil society comes in. And when I talk about development effectiveness, I mean beyond aid. Aid is relevant if it's well done and well given, but you also need other capital flows. And we can use them much better. Public-private partnerships, for instance, to create insurance for poor people on health. We can talk about the whole marketing of products from the consumer to the producer, so we can reinforce the position of poor farmers, for instance. That requires organization, political pressure, and implementation from civil society.
One of the key concerns that will be discussed in Cambodia is that the realization of the shrinking space for civil society across the world. In Africa, it's been reported in about 35 countries. And globally, it has become a very big trend. And there are concerns that without the enabling environment, first of all, civil society will not even have the space to work, that will be effective. But secondly, all these discussions about the Istanbul principles really cannot move any far. What do you have to say about that?
Let me first say, and I say that also since civil society is watching, not all civil society is good. You have good NGOs and bad NGOs. If you have good businesses and bad businesses, good politicians and bad politicians. But in general, development cannot work unless civil society doesn't only get space, but has space and takes space to express itself. And I'm with you worried that in many countries that space seems to be limited. Limiting by governments who are afraid that they get too much money, they become too powerful, they become a nuisance. And I think it's important that in Busan we make a clear signal, a movement that shows that the importance of CSOs across the world is important. And here it is not a matter of donor and recipient.
What do you mean by that when you say movement?
Well, I mean this is not a matter of, donors and recipients. It's a movement among populations in many of the donor countries. Non-governmental organizations want to know what happens with the money. They want to be able to follow the money from where it comes from to the ultimate consumer in a village, in a school, in a road being built. And that combines civil society in the world, and we are still working in a system of state to state. So you have to convince your own governments that they should give more space, but also donors and civil society in other parts of the world should support that movement.
But then the feeling is that it is the very same principles of the same Paris principles that are giving governments the ammunition not to consider civil society.
So no, I think that's nonsensical. Really, I think that has nothing to do with each other. Paris and Accra, for the first time, made very, very clear that civil society, but also the role of parliaments, for instance, should be the key, should be the engine, should be the implementers, should form the checks and balances. And we have to reinforce that. And if there is a movement against space for civil society, then we should be candid in the Busan Declaration if that's the case. I want a candid assessment of Paris and Accra in the final declaration.
There has been concern, and I did raise it in my presentation, about governments misdefining, if I may use that word, the Paris principles, defining ownership and taking it to mid government, defining harmonization to mid control. Is that going to affect the discussions in Busan?
No, this depends very much on you yourselves. When you are in Cambodia, you have also to conquer the space. If some people give some interpretation to Accra, you can blame them, you can be mad, you can be angry, but the importance is of civil society themselves to show what they think of the principles. They are at the technocratic level, so lots of people in the communities, they don't have no idea what accountability is or ownership. These are very political terms. If you talk about ownership, you talk about leadership. If you talk about ownership, you talk about checks and balances and democracy. And you will have to translate in each country what that means.
Okay, it's now June. We have got about 14 days to Cambodia, but we still have about 5 or so months to Busan. What should civil society do or must do between now and the 28th of November to succeed?
I think you have to build a big campaign to make Busan a real success. We see worldwide an enormous risk that aid and development cooperation are put in the corner of old-fashioned politics, of lack of solidarity in the world, and people want to throw away the child with the bathwater. And I think what civil society should be doing, and who am I to say, but if you want to ask me an advice, it's to be also self-critical. Did we do enough in our campaigning to ensure that the aid is effective, that our own aid as service collectors and service providers is effective? And secondly, you have to make a political campaign against all those politicians and governments who say we don't like Busan because it's too technocratic. They have signed up to it. They have made commitments. And if they want to be taken seriously, they better send their best leaders to Busan, otherwise they miss out.
What do you think will be the game changer in Busan? What do you think is going to come out of Busan? Do you think that the Paris principles are going to be abandoned and new principles developed? Do you think that the 3D security agenda is going to overtake the discussions in Busan? Or do you think that there will be a continuation until the MDGs are achieved?
Look, it's clear that the MDGs in 2015 are not going to be accomplished in many countries, including many fragile states. So that means that this is the last chance to act and to do something extra. And we can have great commitments of world leaders, more aid, more on health, more on security and so on. But what a lot of people don't see is that the way we are actually giving that support or working together to make it happen is as sexy as these so-called big initiatives that never lead to anything because never anybody sees the money. So we have to, first of all, I think, when you talk about game changers, I said maybe 2 or 3 things. One is to get aid out of its historical marginalization and make it something modern, not only of the aid bureaucrats and the aid community, but of civil society, but also of the private sector, of the small business sector, of those actors who could do much more to help achieve the Millennium Development Goals. So Busan will be about aid, but also beyond aid. Aid is a catalyst for other actors to gear themselves towards reaching the Millennium Development Goals. That's number one. It has to be a new narrative about aid and development. And I'm sure, second, that then the traditional relationship between donors and recipients will at least be mitigated by many more actors who will be active on this, new civil society, but also middle income countries. And of course that won't go smooth, but if you don't involve other countries like China, India, Colombia, Brazil, then they will not be part about a movement to have better aid and better development. So they have to be listened to, they have to be part of that discussion. So that's the second part. More players, more definition of what is good aid and development, but also to talk about other countries that are involved in this. And if you talk about fragile states, for instance, since we're here today in Liberia, it's important that that fragile state that has developed itself now in an action group of the G7+, that they, like the G77 or the G7 or the G8, that they start coming up with self-confidence to request this need for more effective aid and development in fragile states.
But do you feel that we have done enough as civil society? Because
No,
I am looking at the G7 states, and in about 2 years, they have actually built a formidable force, and they are able to stand up to donors. Do you think that the civil society we have done enough? If not, what do you think?
You know, if you're a good civil society, you have to be ahead. So